Okay guys, so in this video we'll be talking about stack query. Typically inside your React application, you may be fetching data like this as soon as the component loads by firing a call using Axios or maybe the fetch API. Then you may be creating 3 state variables to store the data, the loading state, and if there is an error. And whenever this resolves, you set the data, you set the error, and you set the loading state. So you need to manage 3 states here. But that is not the end. You may want to refetch this data. How would you do that? You may be creating another state variable. You may want to cache data, but then you need to write a lot of code again. Moreover, if one or more components using the same request or the same GET request at different places inside your application, you may be calling your API multiple number of times. So that is the reason we use a third-party library like React Query. It does all that in a breeze. So without any further ado, let's get started. So to get started with React Query, you can click on Get Started and you can simply install this React Query library as a dependency, either using npm, pnpm or yarn. I simply used npm I to install this React Query inside my React application that is created using Vite. If we have a look at the package.json file, we see that the only dependency that I installed is this React Query, and I also installed Axios, though you can also use the web fetch API, but I prefer to use Axios. And then as a dev dependency, I've installed this library also, that is stack React Query DevTools, so that we can see that whether this data is stale or it's in loading state or it's in error state, or to see different kind of states. So therefore we have this dependency also. So let's get back to our app.jsx file, and I've already told you that what all this does. So let's go back once again to our browser and let's have a look at this placeholder API that is a fake REST API which we are going to use for this tutorial. And if we go to this link here, that is /users, we see that we are getting a list of 10 users, and if we go to a particular ID of a user, we see that we are getting a response back with a single user. So this is what I am going to use in this tutorial, that is /users/1. So let's go back. So to use React Query inside your application, you need to go to your entry point, that is our main.jsx file. And here we need to import a couple of things from this React Query library that we installed. So we'll say import something from @stack React Query. And now we need to import the query client provider. So query client provider, we need to import the query client. And then we need to instantiate our query client. So we can say outside this render method, we can say const query client equal to new query client. And now we need to wrap our application inside a query client provider. So we can wrap our app component inside a query client provider, and we wrap our application or the app component inside this query client provider. And this expects a client prop, so we can pass in the client here, and that would be the query client that we initially created at the very top here on line number 7. So that's all what you need to do to initialize your React Query library. So we can save this main.jsx file and we can go back to our app.jsx file. And now what I'm going to do, I'm going to remove all these state variables and this use effect hook from here, or let me keep it here for reference just to show you that how easy it is using this React Query library. So now what I need to do, I need to import one hook from this React Query library to fetch the data. So we can say import something from @stack React Query. And then what we can do, we can simply use the useQuery hook from this library. And now what we can do inside our component, I can say const something equal to useQuery. And then inside the options, we need to pass at least a couple of things, that is the query key and the query functions. So let me write it out first. So let me pass in the query key as /users/1. And then we need to pass in a query function that simply returns a promise with the data, or it throws an error. So what we can do here, we can simply pass in an arrow function here, and here we can simply use our Axios library that we installed. Otherwise you can also use the fetch API. So we can say axios.get, and then we need to pass in the URL of the resource that we want to fetch. So let me copy the URL from here and let me paste it here. So this is the URL that we want to get, and then we have a response here like this, and then we simply return response.data, because you already know that using Axios, response.data contains the actual data, that is this data here. So therefore we need to return the response. If this request fails, it simply throws an error, and that is what this query function expects this thing to do. So let me save this thing here. And now this useQuery hook returns us a couple of things. Firstly, it returns us is error, that is whether this query failed. We have a loading state, that is whether this query is in loading state, and then we also have the data here. So now we see that either we can do all this by using these many lines of code, or otherwise we can simply use this useQuery hook, which simply is much fewer lines of code, but it is much more powerful because it not only gives us the error state, the loading state, the data, whereas it gives us many more things. That is when the data was updated. Using data.updated@, we can refetch the query by simply calling this function that is returned from this useQuery hook. Also, we can simply get the error message, what is the actual error message, so on and so forth. But now let's keep it simple. We can simply ignore these things here. And now let me remove all this boilerplate code from here because we are not going to use that. So now we already saw that if we were in loading state, we want to simply return loading here. If we have an error, so we are going to use is error. So we can use is error. If we do have an error, we can simply return with an error message here. And finally, if we have the data, we can simply JSON.stringify the data inside the application. So that's how easy it is to use the useQuery hook. So now let me save the application. And now let me simply go to my React application, and we see that we have this data here. So now let me also add in the React Dev Tools. So we can go to our main.jsx file, and here we need to import in one more thing, that is React Dev Tools. So from @stack React Dev Tools, and we need to import React Query Dev Tools like this, and we can simply pass it inside our QueryClient provider. So React Query Dev Tools, simply like this. So if we save this, we see that we have this thing here, or this icon here. So if we click here on this icon, we see that this is a stale data. So if we want to simply trigger out something, that is what UI we see when we are in loading state, so we can do that very easily. So we can click on this users tab here, and here we can click on trigger loading. So it would simply trigger the loading state of this React query, and we see this H3. And if we simply trigger error, we see that we are on this thing here, that is this error. Otherwise, we can simply invalidate the query, which simply refetches the query again. So this is how you can use this React Dev Tools, but I'm not going to go too much inside React Query Dev Tools. So now that we know that how easy it is to use React Query inside a component, how do we use it inside another component? So let me create one more component inside the source folder. So let me create a new file called post.jsx, and here I'll simply create a functional component like this, post, and let me import this component inside my app.jsx file just after the free tags here. So here I can simply call in that component, that is this post component, and let me save it. So now if I reload the page, we do not see anything here, and that is because we need to save this post thing here. So now if we have a look at our app component, we see that we are getting this post here. So now if we go to our app.jsx file, and we want to fetch the first post from this API call. So let me copy it and let me paste it here. So if we go to this /post/1, we get the first post here. So how do we fetch this post? We need to do the same thing that we did here. So let me copy all the code from here. So let me copy this and let me paste it inside this post.jsx file. Simply like this. We need to import the useQuery hook from stack React queries. We need to import Axios. So import Axios from Axios. And we can use this data here instead of this post thing to simply render out the post. So we can again use a pre tag here. So we can say JSON.stringify data null 2. So let's save this, and if we go back to our application, we see that we are having a look at this post here, or we are not, because we need to pass this query key as posts here like this, and then we need to pass in this, instead of users we need to pass in posts here. So if I save this, we see that we are getting this post here, and we saw that initially we get a loading state here, and then we got the post here. But on this thing we did not get a loading state because the result of this query was cached. But now you might be wondering that we need to use so many lines of code inside each and every component. We are using this here also, that is this query function. We are using it here also inside this post component. So how do we get rid of all this code? So that is pretty simple to do. What we need to do, we need to go to our main.jsx file, And inside this query client, where we defined our query client, we can pass in some default options here for data fetching. So we can pass in default options here, and for the queries we are going to pass in the default options. So we can simply pass in a query function that resolves to a promise with data, otherwise it throws an error. And this query function is passed with a query key here. So we can say the query key is passed to this query function like this, and then here we need to use axios.get, and here we need to somehow use our query key. So let me paste our query key like this. So query key, and then we have this response here, so we can say response, and then we can simply return response.data, otherwise this thing throws an error. So if we save this thing here, we see that though we are getting the response here, and that is because we are like overriding the query function that we defined inside our inside our main.jsx file. So to use this query function, what we can do, we need to have some kind of a base URL, and since we know that both the query uses this base URL, that is JSON placeholder typicode.com, so we can copy this base URL and we can go inside our main.jsx file, and we can define in the base URL here. So base URL would be this URL like this, and now we can use this base URL here inside our template string. So we can say $base URL / the query key, and note, if you are using / here, then inside your query key you do not need to pass in the / at the beginning. Otherwise, what I would suggest, keeping in the / here and removing it from here, so that it resolves to a valid URL. So that is what I'm going to do here. So let me save this, and now let me go to our app.jsx file, and now even though if I remove this query function from here, so let me remove this query function, our application would be working because we have this data here. And in a similar way, if we go to our post.jsx file, we can remove this query function from here, and this would be valid because like it is working here. We are seeing the result here. So even if I reload the page, we see that we got the data here, we have the loading states as well as we have the error states. So now let me show you one more thing. So let me go to my post.jsx file, and let me simply put in a button here and refetch post. So let me do one more thing here. Let me put an h4 here that simply displays in the time at which this data was updated at. So we can simply get data updated at, and we can spit it out here, data updated at. So and yep, so that's all what you need to do. And we need to import one more thing from here, and that is refetch, and we need to pass this refetch as the onClick event handler on this button. So onClick would be refetch. So if we save this, we see that we are getting this thing here, that is the time when this API call was made or this response was received. So if I click on this refetch post, watch what happens to this time. We would be getting fresh data from the API. So let me click on refetch post. We see that the time changes because we are refetching it at another time. Let me click again. So we see that this is all working here. And now one more thing, that is somehow if you want to revalidate this query, that is invalidate this query key, that is you want to refetch the data and you do not want to use this refetch from here, but instead you want to call it from another component or a third component. So let me create in a new component here. So let me create in a new file called third component.jsx. Let me return in a functional component here, third component, and somehow from this third component we want to refetch this post data that is displayed here at the very bottom here. So that we can do very easily. So we want to have a button here. Of course we want to have a button to simply refetch the data, or this can be done programmatically also. So we have again this thing here, that is refetch data, and just ignore the spelling mistakes here if there are any. And then you want to handle the onClick event handler here. And then what we need to do, we need to use the useQuery client here, not the useQuery hook, but we are going to use the useQuery client. And here we can simply say query client equal to this useQuery client. And now what we need to do, whenever someone clicks on this button or programmatically you want to refresh this data here that is contained inside this thing here. So we need to get a key of this component, that is the query key of this API call. So the query key is this post /1. So let me copy this post/1, and let me go to my third component, and here we can simply say whenever someone clicks on this button, QueryClient.invalidate queries, and here we need to pass in the queries that we want to invalidate. In our case, this query we want to invalidate with this key. So let me save this, and let me simply import this third component inside my app.jsx file just after the post route or the post component. So third component like this. So if we save this thing, we see that we are getting this third component here, and we are getting this refetch data from the third component, and we can make it sure by simply masking out this button. So let me save this now, and now this is the third component. So if we click here, refetch data, watch what happens to this time here. So refetch data, we see that this query was invalidated and we have the fresh data here. And if we open the DevTools here, and if we click on this post one, we see that currently it is stale as it is mentioned here. But as soon as I click on refetch data, we would be in fetching state. So we see that for a fraction of a second, we were in fetching state, and then we simply refetch the data. Okay, so until now we talked a lot about querying data. So let's see that how do we mutate data. So let's go to our app.jsx file, or instead inside app.jsx, let me create a new component, that is a mutation component. So component.jsx, and here let me return in a functional component, mutation component, and let me import this component inside my app.jsx file, and here let me simply do it right away here. So mutation component like this. So let me save this, and we have this mutation component, and for simplicity let me simply remove this post and third component from here. So now let's go back to our mutation component, and here what we need to do to mutate data, what you need to do, you need to make an API call or a post call to your API, and then you can mutate data. So let's say that we want to create a user. So let me create in a function here to create a user. So function create user, and for simplicity I would be calling this button, or I would be calling this function from a button click. So let me provide in a button here that says create user like this, and I want to have an on click event handler here. So on click create user. So typically you would be creating users from some kind of a form, but for simplicity I'm simply using a button here. And to create a user, typically what you need to you simply use this create user thing here, or a function here, and you simply use an Axios call by making a post request to your endpoint with data to create a user. But that's not what we are going to do here. So to create a user using the useMutation hook, we can say useMutation, and this is imported from TanStack React Query. So here inside this useMutation hook, we need to pass in a couple of options. Firstly, we need to pass in the mutation function. So let me do it like this, and then we have a couple of side effects. That is, if this mutation was successful, so we have the on success callback here like this. Or if the mutation failed, so we can handle that on error here like this. And now this useMutation hook returns us a couple of things. Firstly, we get the loading state, that is whether we are in loading state, to show a loading spinner on a button or something like that. That is the mutation is going on. Then we have whether we have an error. Then we have the mutate function also, which is the meat of this useMutation hook. And then we have a couple of more things, that is the error, the reset state, and so on and so forth. So let me save this. And now inside this on success, what we can do, we can simply say console.log success. So console.log success. And in a similar way, we can log the same thing inside the error, that is the mutation failed. And now the meat of this useMutation hook is again this mutation function, which simply returns in a promise or it throws an error. So here what we can do, we can simply say axios.post or patch or put or delete, but I'm using post here. So axios.post, so where do we want to post? So in our case, we are going to post to this URL, that is this URL, to create in a post. So let me copy this URL and let me paste it here, /post to create in a new post. And then we need to pass in a body for this post request. So we can simply pass in data here. And this data comes from this mutation function here, that is this data, and we can get the data here. And then finally we have the response. So then we can simply say response, and here we can simply say response.data like this. So either it resolves or otherwise it throws an error. And now this data would be containing in the actual post. So let me create a fake post here inside this create user function. We are going to use post. So let me simply use create user. So let me hit this endpoint, that is users, instead of post. So now to create a user, let's say const user or new user equal to a name would be, let's say truly, a username would be, let's say truly again, and let's say email would be, let's say yours truly2607@gmail.com. let's say this is our new user. So to pass this new user to this mutation function, you need to simply use this mutate function from this useMutation hook. So whenever someone clicks on create user, we can simply call in that function, that is mutate, and then we pass in the new user here. And this new user is transferred to this mutation function as data, and then we can use Axios to make a post request to this endpoint using this data here. And if everything goes well, we would be able to create a user. And before we handle the on-click event on this button here, we need to return this Axios call because we are inside a curly braces. So we need to return this Axios call, or let me remove this braces here or curly braces here. So now let's save our app here and let's go here and let me click on create user. We cannot see anything, but if we open our DevTools here or inspector here, so we see that we are getting success here. And if we open our network tab here, we see that we have this post request. So let me expand it here. So we see that we made a post request to this endpoint, and this is all what we have. So let me close in this thing here and let me show you one more thing, that is if we click on this button again and again, we see that we are making multiple requests, though the previous requests were pending. So we can do that very easily. So we can disable in the button using this loading state. So if we are in loading state, we can simply disable in the button. So we can say disabled equal to is loading. And also we can simply change in the text also. If we are in loading state, we can display something else. So we can say if we are in loading state, we can say creating user. Otherwise we can simply say create user. So let me save this thing here. And now let me clear out the console here. So let me show you again this thing. So let me click on create user. The button is disabled and we saw created user, and we cannot click that button again and again until and unless previous request has been resolved. So this is how easy it is. So now let me show you how to handle the error here, that is this error. So let's say that we hit an endpoint that does not exist. We can use this error object to display in the error. So we can say is error. So we can check here just below this button. So let me put in an H4 here. So we want to display in this H4 if we have an error. So if is error, then only display in this H4 like this. And here inside the H4 we can simply show the error.message thing here like this. So if we save this and if I click on this create user, we see that initially it tries, but we see that we are getting this message here, that is request failed with status code 404. So typically you want to simply hide this error after a timeout, or otherwise what I can do, I can go inside this H4 and I can simply handle this thing here, that is on click. And here we can simply pass in reset here, that this reset is coming from this useMutation hook, that is this reset. So if I save this and if I click here, we see that the request is resetted here. And if we try again, we are trying to hit that endpoint, but it failed. So now this is working here. So this is all what you need to know about the useMutation hook. So guys, one more thing, that is if you want to simply refetch this data, that is this data whenever you create a user, so you can do that inside the onSuccess side effect. And it is the same way we did that inside a third component, that is we need to use the useQueryClient, and we can use this QueryClient to simply invalidate the query. So we can simply use this thing with the proper key, and you can use that inside this thing here, that is inside the onSuccess side effect using the useQueryClient here. So that I've already told you. So guys, that's all about this video. So if you like the video, do hit the like button, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel, do subscribe to the channel. So thank you, bye bye, tata, take care, and have a good day and have a great day.